Hello, everyone. I assume we're live, and thank you for joining just a few minutes past. We wanted to make sure anyone who was tuning in a few minutes late and started the film had a chance to wrap it up as much as possible. So good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the discussion. This is the opening night of this year's Democracy Exchange Summit. My name is Eva Salinas. I am really happy to join this event, and the co-directors of the film, Charles Kriel and Katharina Gellein Viken, of People You May Know. Most of you just watched that film. This is the first event and discussion of what will be a fascinating summit and festival, and I'm really happy to help kick things off. Just in case some of you are joining us now only for the discussion, People You May Know follows Charles as he uncovers the micro-targeting digital platforms for churches in the United States, targeting vulnerable people to bring them into the church and radicalize them to far-right politics. It's a very brief summary, but we'll get into those issues. But you know, in an election year and with a global pandemic, and after really just a few years of high-level committees that have begun to tackle accountability of the private sector when it comes to privacy and election interference, the spread of disinformation, this is a very fast-moving topic, and we have a lot to talk about in just one short hour. There will be time for questions in the latter half of this discussion, so please do feel free to send them in. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Should be the Q&A feature there. But let me formally introduce, though you did get to know him in the film, Charles. Charles was born, as he mentions also in the film, in the back of a circus wagon and grew up crisscrossing America with his Carney family. He's the former special advisor to the UK House of Commons Select Committee on Fake News, investigating Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. He frequently works to support free press and counter radicalization in conflict zones. He's the author of several books and an award-winning composer. And more behind the camera, but whom we are lucky to have tonight as co-director, Katharina Gellein Viken. Kat's latest work includes People You May Know, of course, a 3-part documentary series, Ari and Half the Kingdom, festival documentary, Just a Number, and Netflix dramatic feature, Hard Tide. In 2019, she shadowed director Douglas McKinnon and showrunner Neil Gaiman on Good Omens for BBC Amazon. Kat started as an actress, giving her a passion for story and character, and began her career producing, directing, and starring in her award-winning short film, Of Her I Dream, based on the true story of losing her mother to cancer. Welcome to you both, and congratulations on the release of this film. Thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, and we're getting you from the U.S. tonight, are we?
You are?
We're in Alabama, in my family home. We're in Fairhope. We arrived here a few weeks ago, just 2 days after Hurricane Sally hit. Is that right? So the power's back on. That's good news. We're really pleased.
Well, that is good for us tonight, then.
we wish we were there in Toronto, and thanks to all of y'all for having us, and particularly Dana Serrano for inviting us to do this. Really honored.
Well, I want to dive right in, and Kat, I'm wondering if you can start us off perhaps by taking us back to when you first picked up the camera with the intention to shoot this project. You know, we start out in the film with the background of Charles's role, especially in preparing UK Parliament to question, you know, Alexander Nix, a former head of Cambridge Analytica. And then we watch as the revelations come up about the use of data by American churches. And I was wondering, you know, what was the film you set out to make originally?
That's a good question. I had just come off Ari and Half the Kingdom, which was a celebrity documentary and not quite in my usual forte. So I wanted to make something serious. And as they say, you should be careful what you wish for. So I set out to make a piece on fake news. And Charles had just started advising the committee. So what happened was he wrote an article for NATO, as he mentions in the film, and he was one of the first to walk into this committee, which was the first of its kind, and say, Cambridge Analytica, when most people were still at the level of, isn't Facebook a nice thing that just connects people? So they asked him the next day to be their special advisor. So I thought this is a really good story to follow. And sure enough, a few weeks later, Chris Wiley, the Observer story broke with Carol Cadwallader, and headlines just started rolling across the world. And I thought this is too good not to just pick up the camera and follow. Mm-hmm. So we started following Charles for the first year, and interviewing the MPs on the committee, going to America with them when they questioned Google, Facebook, and Twitter. But after the first year, it became kind of apparent that the UK was not going to follow their recommendations on regulating micro-targeting and the misuse of the data around elections. So when we were questioning where the film was going next was exactly a bit like the film Icarus, where the filmmaker sort of pivots in the middle, so did we. So we got given this huge trove of evidence about churches in relation to Cambridge Analytica and the use of big data. So we took our 3-month-old baby on the road and crossed America to investigate. So that was really how it came about.
Yeah, it really adds that another level to the conversations that are already beginning, and a really important element there. Charles, for you, I mean, was there a message that you knew you wanted to get out beforehand, or that something you wanted to expose even before these revelations? You know, what part of that message kind of remained despite the change of the focus?
Well, for the film, and certainly for the work that I did in the committee, I was determined to, if we established that Cambridge Analytica was involved in Brexit, then it was really important to me that we got that information out there, and that it at least interrupt the process of Brexit, so that we could consider the idea of just how much that election had been manipulated. Now, we moved off the Brexit topic once the investigation, or once the committee wrapped up. And at that point, I went back to what originally got me interested in Cambridge Analytica in the first place, and made me quite obsessed with the topic. And that was to look at the election of Donald Trump. So I began wanting to target this film around the 2020 election. By understanding what happened in the 2016 election, but really deeply understanding what happened. We had a lot of surface information about Cambridge Analytica, about micro-targeting, about personality profiling, but no one understood that what was really happening is that weapons-grade psycho warfare technology was being used to target the mentally ill in order to leverage people and weaponize them for an election.
And I mean, you know, those links, you know, between the religious right and tech companies and the Republican Party, I mean, how significant are those links in the election, in, you know, election making, you know, thinking especially of the vote around the corner? I mean, you know, a much bigger, you know, how big of the pie of threats and you know, interference is that representing?
Well, do you want to lead on that? I'll follow you. Well, it's hard to know where to begin, to be honest with you, because there were so many ways that this impacts. I mean, you have Russian interference, which is very well documented in the indictment, in Mueller's indictment against the members of the Internet Research Agency, and more than a dozen active Russian agents. So that's incontrovertible. There is the extreme targeting that's been happening, which is also very well documented. And we talk a lot about ads and how that is what's at work, but really it's not the ads that are what's dangerous. What's most dangerous is just posts that end up targeting individuals they're targeting individuals with incendiary content and radicalizing content for profit for Google, Facebook, and Twitter, because the idea is to keep you online as long as possible. And these posts that wind people up, keep people online, keep people clicking. And so they're being served with radicalizing content that hasn't been bought. And it's an algorithm that's targeting them. It's not necessarily someone working on a custom audience. So there's all of that. But then there's what we're probably going to see coming up. It seems by polls that, yes, Joe Biden might win, and I call every election wrong, so bear with me on this. But if he doesn't win by a landslide, and that seems very unlikely, and even if he does win by a landslide, it will take several days for us to reach that conclusion. We're going to see people who feel disenfranchised. And we're going to see people out in the streets who feel disenfranchised from the right until the thing is called for Trump, or from the left until the thing is called for Biden. And then whoever it's called for, we're going to see disenfranchisement on top of that. Now, this is people who have radical opinions who, by comparison to the middle, and let's be clear about that, radical is a really difficult term to define, but who are close to the point of action. And when you're that close to the point of action, being pushed into the point of action or even violence, that groundwork has been being laid for the last 6 years online.
And of course, you know, there's a lot of talk about swing states. And when we talk about, as you said, the connection between the religious right and this kind of thing, I'm not sure that even if we are looking at swing states, we're looking at churches, swing states specifically, because this content is being served to churches on such a large scale. You can see in the movie, there are pastors signed up to networks that network specifically for politics. And these platforms are set up for the purpose of politics. So this is, and it's been going on propaganda-wise for years before digital as well. But now it's all the more powerful and reaches all the more people. And the question in the US is always the swing states, where exactly can you push undecided voters?
Well, and I thought it was interesting in the film. I think it was author Ann Nelson who said Americans have gotten lazy about their democracy. And I wanted to maybe be even more specific than that, because, you know, of course, we see people lining up. We've heard reports of, you know, up to 11 hours to vote just yesterday, you know. And so, you know, how do we kind of see the difference, if there is one, between, say, political apathy and a concern or lack of concern over the way technology is impacting democracy? Do you know, there seems to be an increase in an awareness of the use of our data and the manipulation of our data, but perhaps, you know, still not a full understanding of just how disastrous it is and can be. Would you agree with that? Well, Charles, do you want to start on that one?
Go ahead, yeah, please.
Well, first of all, I think last year when we interviewed Anne, when she said that, I think we were all very worried that this election was going to fly by with the same lack of awareness that we had in 2016. Now, I don't think that's the case right now. I think people are fighting hard. I think people are much more aware. I think the general people are much more aware. I think politicians on both sides are more aware. So I don't think we have the apathy quite now that she was talking about. I think people realize what's on the line this year and in a much bigger degree. Whether we can do something about the targeting right now, I don't think we can, because the regulation has not happened. The legislation has not happened. And short of Twitter and Facebook doing a couple of nominal things to moderate what's going on, I think they're pretty free to do exactly what they did back then.
A couple of things. First of all, it should not take 11 hours to vote. That is not necessary, and it's an artificial condition, and it needs to be recognized, and it should be reported in that way. And it's a horror that it's actually happened. And as an American, even though I live abroad and continue to do so, it's just terribly, really embarrassing. The other thing here is, you know, Twitter and Google have agreed that there won't be any micro-targeting of election ads during this election cycle. I don't know whether we find out that that was absolutely true or not is another story. And as I said, ads are not the main problem. Posts are the main problem. And it's the algorithmic targeting of those posts. But Facebook has not agreed to that. And Facebook's not agreed to reform the political advertising properly until after this election. It's very bad optics. And I don't know anyone who would look at this and not ask really big questions about what the deal is. Because it's not that much money for them, right? It's not that much money. So what's the motivation?
Well, and, you know, you mentioned some gains, but how do you see the momentum? I mean, it seems like we're constantly playing catch up. You know, in just a very short span, you know, there was, even just the news of Cambridge Analytica and their involvement in the Trump election in 2016 and in other countries in Brexit. Mark Zuckerberg was, appeared for in front of the US Senate, but then also this year we had the antitrust, subcommittee hearing. And last year in Canada, both experts and parliamentarians were involved in the International Grand Committee. So, there's a momentum that around governance. I don't know if, for instance, COVID-19, if the pandemic's putting a spotlight on digital activity or clouding it. How do you see the momentum around where we're moving on governance?
Well, I think that the trouble with governance and the momentum's on them is that the people who are elected with these methods do not then go into office and decide to eliminate the methods because they want to stay where they are. And then as Sven Hughes pointed out in our film, that is an ongoing issue. But should legislators find themselves in a position where they tackle these issues, the problem they run into is, how do you keep up with all of the different variables that might happen in trying to legislate issues around social media and electioneering or posts in election cycles and so on? And I think the answer to that, and I think this is an idea that I'm going to find myself rocking a lot in the coming months, is that the social media and the big data giants have a duty of care. And if we begin to legislate around the idea of duty of care, then we have a chance of getting some real legislation through that will have real impact. I also think it's time to break up the giants, but I think that's very easy to say and very hard to execute in terms of what happens with all of the pieces. So it's a complex piece of work to do. But as I've also pointed out to the MPs many, many times, I just say, look, y'all, it's your job to say what people can't do. It's other people's job to figure out how not to do that. You don't have to solve the problem. You just have to say, no, you cannot expose a 9-year-old to this kind of content. Let them figure out how not to expose that 9-year-old.
And you mentioned COVID-19, and of course, now we're online all of the time. So that certainly hasn't made things easier, and very challenging in the conspiracy theory space and the misinformation space. So as we've all seen, COVID-19 misinformation is rife online, and it has taken time to curb. Charles does a podcast called Infotagion on COVID that started off as purely a COVID-19 misinformation debunking effort.
Is that Damien with the MP?
Yeah. And it's really tough because it's just huge, and we're all looking for answers. Everybody's searching for answers anyway, but particularly now. If you saw in the film as well, there's another side to that. These big companies like Barna Glue and the ones that we deal with are now doing weekly surveys for churches. And that's on the surface, of course, to see how your flock is doing, but every question in there is to do with mental health, and that data is then fed into the machine.
And those surveys are based on Alexander Kogan's surveys that he initially used to try to build the first data set for Cambridge Analytica.
Well, and it's so fast, you speak with people in the film, and it seems like they share that what they're doing, without any hesitation, because maybe they don't think of, the negative side of it. I mean, because you were still making the film during COVID, and I mean, did you see any change around that? Did you have discussions even off camera? Did anyone ask questions on kind of, well, what's the problem with what I'm doing? I mean, there's a range, right? Small churches, larger organizations, just how strategic it is. Seems like there's a range, right?
Yes, there's a huge difference. They initially trialed the program that we talk about in the film at 16 megachurch campuses. So they were more aware than some of the smaller churches who are just rolling out a platform that's cheap and it's easy to reach your flock through them. But another thing to really consider is that churches have accepted and adopted digital quite late as an institution. And what's happened and what we consistently saw was that we'd come into a church and they'd say, hey, we got this great program. And it could be Glue's program, could be many other programs as well. And they have just wholesale given that to a software company. So they say, oh, we don't do that. We don't deal with any of the software stuff. So then you have a company that comes in with the church as a customer, and they create an app and a software that can track their congregation, track the children, track everybody who donates, who has a health problem, who attends a grief group, a addiction recovery group, everything. And their data policy may be completely different from the church's. Even if the church says, of course we wouldn't share your information, what that software company's policy is might be entirely different. So that was something we certainly saw a lot of.
You might also want to mention how Glue pivoted in COVID.
Oh yeah, so yes, as soon as the pandemic hit, nearly all of the companies that you see in the film started pivoting their materials towards the COVID pandemic. So they immediately sort of seized on that as an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and Charles, you I think it's you that mentions in the film that at one point about, when things disappear into the media black hole. And, as a journalist, I think about that kind of, just when we don't cover something, what discussions are we preventing? Specifically churches, it seems to be predominantly a phenomenon in the US that they just, how big they are and how tied they are to the political process. I'm wondering if that's something that is also still just not talked about because of, it's still delicate, or, is there still a confusion around, it comes off as a critique of religion itself or something, is it still kind of, where is the lack of media attention on that, or do you see that these stories coming out?
Well, the media black hole is a particular, we'll talk about media black hole first and then do religion. The media black hole is a particular problem right now because of the way that the White House runs news cycles. There is an ever so brief moment to be outraged by what's going on before the next outrageous thing happens. And 3 or 4 days later, you find yourself saying, what was I so pissed off about last week? I can't quite remember. And if you go back and look, it's enormous and it's relevant to you, but there's just so much. So, and it's a clear strategy, and we see Bannon talk about it. And, it's like you're just, throwing as much crap in the channel as you possibly can, so that people won't understand what is true and what is not true and what they should continue to be outraged about. But this is also a very clear technique of the Kremlin, and has been a technique of the Kremlin at first within their own country, and then Ukraine, which is the the hot lab for disinformation techniques around the world. You want to know what's about to happen to you, go look in Ukraine, because history arrived there first. When people can't trust their own side and they can't trust the other side because the Kremlin has made it clear that they financed both sides and manipulated both sides, at that point, nobody believes anything. And there's an excellent documentary called Hypernormalization by Adam Curtis that addresses that specific issue. It's really worth having a look if nobody's had a look. Now, on the churches, many of the members of the Council for National Policy own big church, big religious broadcast networks in America. The whole bottom of the spectrum, which used to belong to public radio, is getting bought up in the US by religious organizations as local radio stations, local media shuts down. And no big broadcaster, no big news network, no news program, nobody in America wants an organized Christian-led boycott of their product. And I think that's a real problem for reporting on religion, reporting on the religious right, reporting on the politicization of the religious right, and reporting on the politicization of the churches.
And it's a very easy thing, as you pointed out. The immediate knee-jerk response is it's anti-Christian, it's anti-Catholic, it's anti-religion. When in fact something like our film is pointing out exploitation of religious people on a very large scale. It's also a confusing topic, you know, and online and the news right now is not a space for nuance, as Charles very often says.
We don't live in an age of nuance, no.
So if you want to take the time to explain to somebody about data and the link to religion, or the link that this is a little complex, and it's a little bit, and it's nuanced, and that's, you don't have time. We're all exhausted by the news anyway. Part of what I set out to do as a filmmaker with this film was to at least tie some connections that people could watch and be engaged in, because I think we read about data and we think, okay, that's terrible, my data's been stolen, and you kind of tune out after that. So I was really keen that we could put out something that would make people go, okay, this is the direct effect it has on me and my life and these elections.
Well, and Charles, and your background is, you know, working on radicalization. And so I'm wondering if, you know, that I think you mentioned you know, just even saying there's a parallel there, but of course people would want to distinguish, because when we think of radicalized groups, we're thinking of, you know, a lot of violence. And so what's the importance of the parallel, though, that you think is worth making that case there? And we are shifting we're talking about extremism and what it can mean. That's a conversation that's happening in Canada, but yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fraught terminology to start trying to define radicalization or the radical and terrorism and activism and so on. It's really very difficult, and better minds than mine struggle with it. So I don't want to try to supersede that, but I can talk to you about how I think about it. And I'm certain people in the audience will have a lot to say about that. So I've done work I do work all across Northern Asia, across the Caucasus, across the Middle East, Ukraine, Iraq, and so on. And most of the time, historically, I've been out there supporting independent local journalists. And these are usually people who are opposed by the government, opposed by the enemy in the war. So they're opposed by both sides. They're opposed by the oligarch-owned media and the commercial media too. So I'm working with people who are trying to do journalism in the interest of the civil society. But while you're out there doing that work, what you find yourself dealing with most of the time is disinformation and radicalization. And so independent journalism and free press, disinformation, radicalization, and terrorism to a degree are all tied up with one another, and to a degree they become a lot of the same topic. Terrorism is easy to back away from, because we can say terrorism is what happens when someone commits a violent act. But radicalization is what happens when we run someone right up to that border, right up to the edge of that violent act. And we position somebody to act, and they may be ready. What did we hear? Stand back and stand by. You know, which is just one of the most unbelievable events of my adult life, was to see that debate and that happen. So to get that person in that position, in that radical position, you're not going to take me and radicalize me. That's not going to happen. Kat's not going to get radicalized. You're probably unlikely to get radicalized. We've only just met, but you seem like a nice person who's somewhere in the middle, lefty leaning maybe, but that's about it. You know,
is my pin showing though?
But you know, if you have someone who is in the middle, they're very hard to move, and it's hard to move someone from the left to the right, hard to move someone from the right to the left. But if you've got someone on the edge, as we said in the film, then if you can find the people who are emotionally vulnerable, those people can be captured, and they can be converted, and they can be brought into a community. You know, Islamic State, you know, one of the things that they're very, very good at, or were good at when the caliphate was running, is to say, it's the caliphate. Look at what we're doing here.
There's a place for you.
There is a place for you. There's a place for you to come, and you can belong here, and there's a role for you, and you don't have to be just, another Muslim in North England who's not going to be able to get a decent job and living in a white council estate. There is a place for you here. Come and join us. And that's what the churches are doing to a degree as well. And once you capture somebody, then they can be moved, they can be monetized for the church and weaponized for politics.
And we mentioned mental illness targeting, and it's not just mental illness, it's being vulnerable in general. These programs are around things that we all experience at one point in our life or another. Grief, financial struggles, relationship struggles, very human things that we all go through. And I've used myself as an example a lot in this process because I lost my parents young. And I had evangelical grandparents. My mother was a Christian. I grew up going to church. So I would be what they would model as open to an invitation. And if they had caught me on the back of my mother's death, when I felt like I had nobody, I had no community around me, that's a powerful, powerful connection that you can then open your arms and say, come in, there's friends here, there's people with the same experience, you're going to be okay. That's really, really powerful. And you don't have to target me for months with ads. You just have to catch me with the right thing at the right time, with a post that says, come here, we've got the answer for you. And I would also say, in the conspiracy theory space, you see a lot of anti-vax movements, all of that online. If you have somebody searching for a truth and you think you've found it, you've seen this thing and you think you've found the truth, you become then a disciple of the truth, and you can pass that on to other people. And that's a feeling of power. These things it's catch you at the right time of vulnerability. I think radicalization is easier than we might think.
I've got a whole theory about conspiracy theory. I'll see if I can figure out how to compress it into about two sentences. The reason that people end up believing in conspiracy theory is like the reason that people end up believing in religion. It's that it's so hard to face the idea that you can live a good life and be a good human being and be kind to everybody, and then a hurricane comes along and it wipes out your whole family. And that the universe is just chaos. It's so hard to believe that like a handful of guys with box cutters could bring down the Twin Towers and crash a plane into the Pentagon. But it's a hell, because it's too chaotic and it makes us too uncomfortable. It's hard like that. Like it's hard to look at pictures of the Milky Way. You're confronted with the ineffable, with that chaos, but it's pretty easy to believe that, Dick Cheney might have done it. Okay, great. That makes sense, because then there's some kind of vertical order and vertical structure to what's going on. It's not a chaotic universe, and there is a father. It's a malevolent father. It's Dick Cheney, but someone's in charge.
Yeah. I want to, just looking at the time, make sure we take a few audience questions. We have a couple already. So unless you, Kat, you had anything you wanted to add there to that thought before we move on. Okay. So we have a question from Lalitha. How can former evangelicals expose and challenge the radicalizing tactics of churches without further harming the vulnerable people these churches target?
It's a tough one. I mean, I would say go look at people online who have gone through this. So Gloria Beth Amadeo, who's in the film, is doing a lot in that space. She writes a very open blog. She's in a couple of documentaries. She's publishing a book, I think. And it's just, I think, being honest about your own experience while still, and you might still be religious, you might still want to honor that, but to just be, to listen to people who, and acknowledging that we're in a world where everybody needs connection and we need people and we need to be there for one another, but that we don't get sucked in by tactics that are just there for politics or just there to exploit our divisions. So awareness is the first step, but looking to other people who are doing good works in that space, I would say.
We have another question and comment from Francis. Charles and Kat, great film, but nerve-wracking. I would like to hear what advice you have for individuals in terms of protecting one's data in these days of targeted marketing with big data, even with data protection laws in place in a few countries, like here in the UK.
Okay, well, that's a really challenging problem, and there's a couple of things to address about that. And I just want to say them first so that I don't forget them. First, it's about the ownership of your own data and the protection of your own data. And second, have I forgot it already? I'd like to talk about how some of the data regulation has gone wrong. So on owning your own data, forget about it, right? If anybody comes to you and if Brittany Kaiser tries to sell you on you should own your own data and use my Bitcoin in order to try to buy and trade it, like turn her into the feds. This is what you need to do.
Former Cambridge Analytica.
Former Cambridge.
Yeah.
Former is a broad church. It's a complex word. Anybody who's selling you a scam about owning your own data and selling your own data just wants your goddamn data. And they'd like you to buy into their scam. So I recommend you not get involved in that. Also, don't give up on protecting your data because just because all of your data is out there already, and just because there is inferred data about you and there's a data profile, 5 years from now, you're not going to be the same person that you are right now. You're going to make different money. You might be with a different lover. You might have a different job. You might live in a different place. And as all of those things about you change, if you've been protecting your data all along, it's kind of like if you'll just quit smoking now, in 7 years, your lungs are going to be much better.
Any pieces of data, when you say protect your data, that people might not be, thinking, I mean, whether it's your posts or what devices you use.
Sign in with Facebook. That's one that we never do, No, don't use if you want to sign into something, use your email and your password. Do not sign in with Twitter. Do not sign in with Facebook. That's immediately handing over stuff. Don't do Facebook quizzes. That's a very simple one. I hope we're all aware of that by now, but we might not be. Anywhere that says, oh, post an old and a young photo of yourself, or take this quiz to find out which Harry Potter character you are. Just that is a straight up attempt to rake your data, and in the past, at least, your friends' data as well. So avoid those like the plague.
So if you're giving up a lot of your data, you need to decide who you trust. Decide who you trust carefully, because if you're going to use a credit card, they know everything they know as much about you as Facebook knows about you. So you have to choose carefully which credit card you're using. And as we've been saying for 10 years, if it's free, then you're the product being sold.
Right.
So there are apps that are better out there now. Signal, has a better privacy policy than things like WhatsApp. Definitely things like Snapchat. So you can narrow your usage now. Even Charles and I are on Facebook. You can't avoid that these days. They have too much of a monopoly. But you can reduce your usage, and you can restrict and wipe your data as much as possible. There are functions to do that now.
Well, I'd like to just very quickly address how data regulation can go wrong before we move on to the next question. So GDPR has been put in place, and I think GDPR is a terrific document. And I think it's brave and it's bold, and it's great that the European Union has done that. And as the UK and the United States are showing that they're compromised on democracy, I think the EU is one of the last places to look, despite whatever neoliberal critiques I might have of the EU. However, in work that I'm doing in Central and Eastern European states, what I'm finding is that autocratic governments are using the General Data Protection Regulation in order to prosecute NGOs out of business. And so this great tool of GDPR, which was supposed to save all of us for our data, is actually being used to shut down democracy around the edges of Europe. And we need to pay attention to this and the way our tools can go wrong. So it's a warning.
Well, and that leads me in a way to the next question, which is about, have you heard about any radicalization of Christians in Canada? I also, on my list of questions, as you know, most Canadian interviews will ask, especially you know, a subject that's global, you know, were there any Canadian links? I was just thinking the link there of Citizen Lab doing good work on researching, you know, how to protect the nonprofit sector and journalists. But yeah, just any Canadian connections come up in the investigation of this?
Well, let me talk about this, and you talk about that guy. First of all, the data set that Chris Vickery found online and what he provided to us on the hard drive was left open and exposed by Aggregate IQ, which is a Canadian company and was a part of Cambridge Analytica.
So yeah, that was one of the first crumbs on the trail for us. A video that Vickery also showed us early on from Canada was really interesting. It didn't end up in the film, but it's from a pastor, a Canadian pastor, talking about billionaires funding the same kind of scheme that got Donald Trump elected. And he's very excited about it, talks to a big audience, and really saying for the next elections in Canada, this is what we have to do. This is what got Trump elected. This is how we get it done in Canada. So there are excited churches in Canada who want to do the same thing. And we've seen it.
But you'll have to keep Canada democratic, because we're in the process of going to Norway for a little while as the pandemic continues and the inevitable crash comes after that. But we keep looking to Toronto.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if that video came out in the lead up to the 2019 election here. There was a task force that looked at that, and I know, you know, I've listened to interviews, you know, with those who were part of that task force, and you know, saying that they thought that did better prepare them, that disinformation was less during that election. I mean, it did also come at a time we've just shifted the discourse from talking about foreign interference to, you know, just whether it's algorithms and just forces within the country. So it's hard to say, you know, how real that threat would have been without the task force. But yeah, I mean, it's something that right now, you know, no election yet on the horizon, although it could happen here.
There's a terrific report on disinformation and bots put together by the Oxford Internet Institute, Oxford UK. But they do country by country reports, not all countries, but they have a terrific report on Canada. And most of that, what stands out about that report is it's about how it's so positive about Canada. And it talks about how Canada is actually using bots to expose disinformation, or using Twitter bots to provide information to the public. So it's worth going and having a look at. It's the Oxford Internet Institute.
Well, you know, so when the bar, you know, there's a number of different bars, so it's hard to know kind of where we sit sometimes. Okay, there's a few, I'll just maybe, let me just have a look. We have a few more minutes, and there are a few more questions. So, lack of connection/disconnection, as you said, makes individuals more prone to radicalization. How would we navigate that fact, especially now where we have extreme polarization coupled with lockdown-induced disconnection?
Can
question.
For a minute? So in my, there's a really great theorist named Todd McGowan who talks about capitalism and psychoanalysis a lot, and I'm really interested in what he has to say. But he helped me to understand some of the issues around the worst aspects of contemporary capitalism, especially as when it's very libertarian. And the job of a startup, and I've had a startup and I'm about to have another startup, so I understand that space pretty well. The job of the startup is to find it. The ultimate thing they can do is find a public space and then inject themselves into that space in a way that people have to pay them to continue to use it. And what social media did is it found the public space of friendship, and it injected itself into that exchange in a way that now people have to go through social media in order to maintain the friendships that they have had in the past. And of course, algorithms make you have new friendships that you wouldn't have had otherwise, because the algorithm is showing you the content of people that you maybe really didn't care about that much, but after 2 or 3 years of it, suddenly they're your closer friends than other folks who were your genuine friends. I think it would be really liberating if we could start having real face-to-face friendship again. This is a really tough thing to do when friendship is arbitered through Zoom, which it is to a large degree now, and we've become more dependent upon social media under COVID restrictions. But I think getting back to real friendship and real dialogue is absolutely critical right now.
Yeah, you know, and even picking up the phone and just being very, very critical of what you see. We see stuff online all the time that we're being targeted with, and one thing is stuff we want to buy, but if it's something that's there to talk to you when you're vulnerable, and sign you up for things in that space in relation to COVID or depression or anything like that, I would be very, very careful of that, and look to other sources and do your own research rather than something and be a part of that scheme. We're all particularly needing that kind of thing right now, and we have to be more vigilant.
Mm-hmm. And those individual actions, of course, are happening while we're also continuing with the discussions around, you know, what can happen for governance, and you know, how do we have accountability for, you know, a sector that is driven by profit and not necessarily having, you know, our democracy not at all having democracy as, you know, its interest.
And we also have to say, you know, not to always bring the darkness for, like we do in this film, but it's not just churches that have gotten this data about your vulnerabilities. There are also the same investors behind these schemes, not mentioning any names right now, but they also invested heavily in a lot of very well-known wellness apps. We're talking about stuff like meditation and depression, things that you know very well and probably have on your phone. So where somebody is raking your data, asking you how you are on a scale and how you're feeling, that is something we just need to be very skeptical of, because somebody is using that.
Apps for depression, apps for alcoholism, apps for addiction. It's really important to check the privacy settings of these things.
We have quite a few more questions, but I'm just going to ask a final wrap up, just to let us know if there might be something that, you know, follow up since kind of you stopped filming. A lot happens in a short amount of time on these issues, or something we should be keeping our eye on. I mean, obviously this film came out, you know, right on the eve of the vote in the US, but this is ongoing. So, you know, what are you keeping your eye on? Anything interesting that we might note that's kind of on your radar right now?
Well, just what we were just talking about, actually. So one thing is to be aware of is churches and that space, but also things like ancestry apps and wellness apps. So places that are getting enormous amounts of information, even your DNA, your blood tests, these new kinds of apps that are supposed to be for our physical and mental health, or even just for fun. That's somewhere that I think the space will be in health data. That's where we need to keep our eye on next.
Yeah, and I've got my eye on what's happening with Elizabeth Denham and the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. Elizabeth is Canadian, so it might be relevant to a lot of your audience. What's happening with her report on Cambridge Analytica. So very keen to see what happens there, but also after the report, the analysis of the report, how it ends up being handled by several of us who are doing investigations and in the media. I've always got a watchful eye to see if some of these people we've been investigating end up getting their doors knocked down and let out in handcuffs, but we'll just have
Anybody
to
yet?
wait. Not yet.
No, we did get an open letter from Glue denouncing it as conspiracy theory, which we were expecting.
Yeah, but I'm kind of keen to make a cooking show or something.
Something about.
Well, and you'll be in the U.S. for election day.
Yes, we will. Yeah, we will. And should I do what I think is going to happen? I mean, I don't think anyone will be surprised by it, but unless there is an overwhelming and very quickly delivered vote for Biden, then I think we're going to see the right in the street, disenfranchised, insisting that it's not been a fair election. We're going to see the left in the street, disenfranchised, insisting it's not been a fair election. And it seems like the only thing that's going to solve that, given that the court is so out of balance right now, the Supreme Court, the only thing that's going to solve that is actually the people themselves. And while in the past I might have felt less discomfort than I feel right now, I'm incredibly uncomfortable with that notion right now, because the idea of violence as a valid option in solving this election it's been endorsed, and it's a really uncomfortable thing. I don't think we're going to have to run because we don't need our go bags at the ready, because we're in Alabama right now. This is Trump territory. It's nothing but Trump territory, even though we might not be Trump people. I don't think there's going to be much violence in the streets here, but I'm worried for some of my home cities like Atlanta and St. Louis.
Well, regardless, stay safe, obviously, and that doesn't feel unrealistic to say. I want to thank you both so much, Charles and Kat. Congratulations on the release of the film. And for those who want to rewatch it, it is up in a few places online, is it not?
Yes, it's on Sundance now, which is available through Amazon, and Fusion in the States. I believe it's Sundance in Canada as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, and the UK, and I'm not sure if Fusion's available in Canada or not.
No, but Sundance is a pay-per-view channel in both Canada, UK, and US.
And then broadcasters around the world.
Great. Thank you both again. And thanks to everybody who has joined us for this conversation. It's such a great way to kick off this summit. Democracy Exchange will begin again tomorrow at 8:30 for welcome ceremonies, followed by the opening keynote of tomorrow, Imagining Our Collective Future Through Narrative, a science fiction author's guide at 9 a.m. That's Eastern time, of course, featuring speculative fiction authors Wabgeshig Rice, Cory Doctorow, Karen Lord, in conversation with Anna Serrano. This summit continues until October 15th. For more information or the full schedule, go to democracyexchange.org, or you can find it for those who have the sessions open in the navigation bar that you're looking at. So final thanks to the team for inviting me to be part of this event. It's been really a pleasure to chat with you both and be part of it. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, and see all of you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks, Eva.
Bye.
Bye.